Προτονοτάριο. Όσοι τον γνώρισαν ξέρουν το μέγεθός του. Θα μιλήσει ένας φίλος και συνεργάτης του Νίκου, ο καθηγητής McKenna, και θα προεδρεύσει η κυρία Τσατσοπούλου.
Καταρχήν θέλω να ευχαριστήσω πολύ την ιδιαίτερη τιμή που μου κάνει ο κύριος Εφθημιάδης και η Οργανωτική Επιτροπή με αυτό το session, και κυρίως γιατί σήμερα είναι 6 Δεκεμβρίου. I would like to thank the organizing committee and Professor Efthimiadis for this honor. And the most of all is the honor that Professor McKenna is going to talk in this privileged lecture. And I would like to tell you that Professor McKenna, apart from his exceptional intellect, he also has an exceptional emotional intelligence and a special talent for recognizing the skills, the aspirations, and the needs for the people working with him. He's a forward-thinking leader, so the results for his projects and teams have greatly advanced our understanding and treatment for cardiomyopathies and inherited cardiac disorders. It was an honor for me and NIKOS to meet him in our life. Professor McKenna.
Adelina, thank you. So this is the title, NIKOS disease in historical perspective, but this is very much a tribute to our chairperson, her late husband, who really are responsible for all of this. So this is Adelina, obviously, and NIKOS, and this is a quote from Yoko Ono, and when she was married to John Lennon, they decided to have their honeymoon in a hotel in Montreal for about 2 weeks, and this was open season for the TV cameras and everybody. But this is what she said: if you dream alone, you just have a dream. If you dream together, you actually have reality. And NIKOS and Adelina had a dream. It arose because of circumstances ending up in NIKOS for their military service and seeing a young man die suddenly and finding this family. But that was very much their dream. The context in that era, there were really 2 papers, the paper by Frank Marcus and a paper by Edward Rowland in the early 80s, which described what was called ARVD. It's not really a dysplasia. It was switched to ARVC, arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. And in these 2 studies, they were 8 or 9 or 10 patients, and basically the phenotype was very similar. They were syncopal episodes, left bundle branch block VT, there was sudden death, it was predominantly males, the ECG was characteristic with T-wave inversion, and there was a dilated right ventricle, and what was surprising to people at the time is that the left ventricle seemed normal, and the coronaries were normal, and concepts of disease was coronary disease, and how can you have a heart disease that doesn't have left ventricular abnormality? So right ventricular became the key, it's isolated right ventricular disease. At the time, and I showed this slide, now we just do Google and PubMed and stuff. In that era, you had to go to either the library or Index Medicus to get the literature. And this is a very old slide from that era. And if you look on the names, and I've highlighted some of them, these are mainly case reports, 1 patient, 2 patients, mainly with a ventricular arrhythmia of left bundle branch block. But the names, well, Guy Fontaine and Frank Marcus, yes, but Dennis Crickler, editor of the British Heart Journal, Mel Scheinman, leading electrophysiologist of the West Coast, and the names, these were the great and good of world electrophysiology at the time. Into this group comes this paper in 1986, and so this is before any major genetic studies have been performed. It comes this paper, and I think we're all familiar with it from NIKOS, and I'm not going to go into detail, but basically it was observations by NIKOS and Adelina in relation to the kinky hair, the palmar-plantar keratosis, which are shown here, that led with the recognition of a young man who died suddenly, that there must be some link between this, and the heart. Sent the heart to Athens, ARVC, sent it to Gaetano Ceni, who was the guru of and is, he and Christina still the gurus of the pathology, and they confirmed that this was ARVC. They published this family, and there were 9 cases. They were familial, and you see that for male predominance, they all had the hair and skin phenotype, so that makes it easy to identify who's potentially at risk. They had ventricular arrhythmia, syncope, and curiously, if you look on the far right column, the great and good had not made a correct diagnosis. So at one center, no names, Epstein's anomaly, tricuspid valve replacement. Presumably the right ventricle was dilated, and we can do something about this. Another major center, DCM, but basically this was outside of the perspective of most normal cardiologists. The other detail that's in this paper really relates to the QRS, to the electrocardiogram and QRS prolongation, incomplete interventricular conduction defects, right bundle, and the abnormal ECG. And if you look at the column in inverted T waves, the majority of these patients had T wave inversion beyond V3. So they had right and left ventricular disease. And this became, this was probably shouldn't have been a surprise as to where we are now with left ventricular involvement. And again, almost by definition, the right ventricle was larger than the left. So this is a brief summary of these families, but this is also a brief summary of the Frank Marcus paper, Roland paper, and the other papers that I showed from Index Medicus. So the electrocardiographic abnormalities are predominant. The echo is abnormal with particularly the right ventricle. And there's arrhythmias and sudden death. Now here we have a situation. So we're in late 90s. We have the first gene for hypertrophic has just coming along in 1988, 89, 90. No question who the captain of this project was. And anybody who sailed will know on a boat you have a boss. And the boat, you have a boss, and this was NIKOS, and you have people who have to do the work. That was Adelena as well. So this is NIKOS at the helm, and he was very much the helm of this project from the beginning. This led, and for our good fortune, this led to them looking around the world and saying, who do we want to collaborate with in relation to the genetics? And we had been involved, not so much finding the genetics, but certainly in the phenotyping and linkage analysis. And it was our good fortune they came to us, and this, I'm sure we're all familiar with this, is a Lancet paper with the identification of a 2 base pair deletion in all of the affected, as a recessive, all of the affected individuals in the families. And I've highlighted at the top, so who are the authors? Usually the last author has something to do with orchestration. Here, Godfrina McCoy was a postdoc working at St. George's in the genetics lab. She did the lab work, but the ideas were not coming from the back end of the paper. The ideas in terms of what we're looking for, what genes are we looking for, was NIKOS and Adelena. Now NIKOS didn't speak great English. In fact, he didn't speak any English, at least not to me. But you never really knew what he was thinking, as we didn't. As Greeks you would. But the famous quote, and at big American meetings, and Adelena would stand up and say, NIKOS says. And that, I think of NIKOS says with Adelena. But NIKOS and Adelena said, actually, this must be some gene that can link cell adhesion here, less understood in the hair, at least I never understood it, but certainly in the hands and feet, to the heart. The geneticists were very influenced by keratin abnormalities in an Irish family that had been published with desmoplakin, but they missed that. They were thinking of keratin, and they looked for keratin genes. So Godfrina, Monday to Friday, would follow the orders of the geneticists. Saturday and Sunday, she'd follow the orders of NIKOS and Adelena, and that's the gene was found. So credit to you. Now, just in the summary of the abstract, it's not only it would say conclusion, but it says interpretation. The finding of a deletion in plakoglobin in ARVC suggests that the proteins involved in cell-to-cell adhesion play an important role in maintaining myocyte integrity, and when junctions are disrupted, cell death and fibrofatty replacement occur. And that's our concept of the overt phase of ARVC. That's the phase where you have cell death, you have arrhythmias. That's the phase we recognize on imaging and electrocardiography. But there's an occult phase that occurs before that. And that occult phase is when you get electrical conduction disrupted before you have cell death. So you won't have fibrosis. If Mary examines the heart, it may look normal. If you look on electron microscopy, the gap junctions are very abnormal. But there's that occult phase is the most dangerous phase in terms of risk of sudden death. And that was understood by these guys at a very early stage. Again, just to put this in context, again, look at the dates. This is 1995, 94 to 99. So the first gene for hypertrophic is 1990. So everybody's excited. You do linkage analysis, and linkage means you take the phenotype in the patient, and you say, does this patient carry the abnormal, yes or no? And then you look to see all the people who have this abnormality, do they have the spelling mistake that you've identified, the mutation or variant that you've identified? And of these 7 loci, 6 of them were incorrect. So, and you'd say, these guys don't know what they're doing. No, not really fair, because this was Padova, it was Houston, it was a very good group in Scandinavia, Karina Blomström-Lundqvist. The only locus which was correct is the ARVC5, and the group in Houston did not find the gene. That was found by Kathy Hodgkinson and the group in Newfoundland, TMEM43. So the problem is the diagnosis, and in that era you didn't have high quality MRI. What you had is electrocardiogram, the symptoms, but electrocardiogram, RV echo, which is problematic, and arrhythmia of left bundle branch buck, which is probably your best signal. But it just gives you an idea of the value of this family that Nikos and Adelena studied. And here is the hypertrophic. How was that gene found? Well, the bottom pedigree is a New England paper, and this family came from the village that I come from in Montreal, in Canada. And we had the privilege of studying this family. And this family, just like the NIKOS family, all of the individuals with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy had full disease expression by their late teens. Abnormal ECG, abnormal echo. That is very, very, very unusual. When you think if you have to make one slide of the genetics of any of these conditions, it's incomplete penetrance, age-related disease expression. In this Canadian family, everybody had the disease. The other thing, if you look at the pedigree, there's several of these poor wives had 13 children. And the women will appreciate this. And Peter Paré was able to track back the records. And there were a large number of people, and he noticed that there was about half the people had died before the age of 40. And those were the half who had it. And this was before recognition of treatment. And they died suddenly, they died in heart failure, they died from stroke, but they had early disease expression. And that made this family valuable. That's how the gene was found. And there was lots of linkage analysis in Hokum, which was incorrect. In the ARVC, it was the ability to link the skin and hair phenotype to the cardiac abnormality. Again, here, Nikos and Adelena, in looking out, they became ambassadors for ARVC, for the genetics of this condition. So here, we had the privilege, because of the disease gene and the finding we visited, and the upper left is Alex on the left, my 2 sons, and then Yanis, and then the characters you'll recognize in the front row. Now, you wouldn't have thought, anybody who knew Nikos, I wouldn't have thought he was the reincarnation of Ronaldo. But he obviously, and my wife, who doesn't know much about football, said, oh, he scored a goal. I said, he's leaning far too back. That couldn't have been a great shot. But basically, he engaged on a beach in Kofanuse with us and entertained our family. And Nikos' ancestry, his father was a fisherman. And 2 things. One is, I remember he took us up to the north side of the island. He said his father used to sit watching during the war for the Nazi PT boats, marine activity. And the other is he wanted to take us up the north coast of the island in what I recall was an old red fishing boat. And it was really windy. This was Greek Easter, mid-April. It was before Greek Easter in, I don't remember what year, but a long time ago.
2003.
Sorry?
2003.
Thank you. She knows more. She's testing me. I'm going to get scolded afterwards for missing things, getting the date wrong. But we went up, and it was really rough. It was much too windy, and I remember I was afraid. If you went inside in the boat, it smelled of kerosene. If you stood outside, I thought we were going to blow away. Finally, NIKOS said, okay, we give up. So we went on the lower right, one of the adjacent islands, Kofanise, and this is Captain Yanis. Captain Yanis, that side, you're protected from the winds between that side of Naxos and Kofanise. So he said, oh, let's go out. We'll go out and bring in the nets. And he'd put out nets the night before. We got up at 3 o'clock to come in, put out the net, pull in the nets. And there were Captain Yanis and the 2 men, and they pulling in these nets by hand. The wind is howling, and in the nets there was 1 fish head and a bit of old crab and maybe a few fish, maybe 20 kilos, 25 kilos of fish maximum for what was putting the nets out, risk to the nets, bringing them in, repairing the nets. Anyway, after all this, my sons decided they better stay in school because they didn't want to become fishermen. And Captain Yanis invited us to, it was either a Saturday or Sunday, to lunch with his extended family. And the food on Kofanise everything was produced from Kofanise. The bread, it was dandelion greens, it was that season, and all the fish. And we ate the entire catch, whatever we were, about 15 or 20 people. But it was memorable. And that was typical, that was our experience. But it wasn't just us. So they reached out, and if I look in the hypertrophic community, we're a collection of egos that have not played ball together. We have not collaborated. Our guidelines are not great, etc. In the ARVC community, NIKOS and Adelena provided a catalyst for people who may not have working together. So here in the lower right, the guy with the little beard is Jeff Safitz. He was and probably still is the world expert in arrhythmia pathology, cardiac pathology, and he was at Washington University in St. Louis, now at Harvard. They put together collaborations with Jeff, collaborations with Calkins and his group, with Utrecht, and with obviously the Padua group. And these are groups that may not have spoken to each other that much. Adelena and NIKOS were the catalyst, and for many reasons. One is their insights, but also they had tissue. And tissue was valuable in terms of being able to study the immunology and the underlying disease. So this was a very exciting collaboration, and one that from a family standpoint, from a growth standpoint, very important, and for the understanding of this disease, very important. Obviously, I think we're familiar with this, but the discovery of the plakoglobin gene led fairly quickly to identification of the other desmosomal variants, mutations, desmoglein, desmocolin, desmoplakin in particular, and better understanding. Now, where are we now? Well, we've great discussions and guidelines around phenotypes. Andre and I were talking about non-dilated left ventricular, or whatever it's called, in the new guidelines. I mean, we should be talking about genes, and here is an initiative led by Hugh Calkins and Firat Duru, which brings together everybody, we don't like the Padua group, or everybody that wants to be involved in this, to develop a genetic diagnosis, a gene-led diagnosis for ARVC. These are the genes. You'll recognize them all, but plakophilin-2, which is the most common desmoplakin anyway. The one gene missing from this is lamin, and lamin is going to be the subject of a separate report. There was some politics because lamin is huge, and it involves a completely different set of groups and people. But basically, this is an initiative from Calkins mainly to bring together the world community, stimulated by NIKOS and Adelena's work in this area, so that within a year we will have a manuscript on the phenotypes and outcomes of all these different genes. And that's what we need, not just in ARVC, but the idea that ARVC is doing, or ACM is doing this ahead of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which had a 10-year head start and is a much easier disease to handle, is a shame on the HCM community. Just one example of, there's these risk models have come out. The risk models are, how can you have a risk model that doesn't have your sex or gender in the model? How can, because we know there's huge differences. How can you have a risk model that doesn't have the gene? Now, we can understand why, because we didn't know the genes, but with ARVC, the risk model the original one is very heavily dependent on plakophilin-2, because the majority of Hopkins, Utrecht's patients who were the major contributors to the risk model have plakophilin-2 mutations. But that group have gone on, and this is a recent paper on the desmoplakin risk model, and it just shows that the variant that you have in desmoplakin is different. It's the same with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. You need to know the specific variant. Don't just lump them all together and say, oh, It's the desmoid plaque versus plakophilin. So this is fundamental going forward in our understanding of disease. The other aspect, you know, I think in life, I quoted Yoko Ono, but the other one, my father-in-law always said is, you know, the best thing you do in life is give the next generation a better chance than you had. And I think NIKOS would be very proud of that picture on the left with Yanis and Alex in particular. I haven't mentioned Alex, but I always said Alex knew more cardiology before he went to medical school than most medical graduate doctors do when they graduate. And he will be very much, I don't know enough about Yanis and his, but Alex will very much be the future in relation to this kind of work. I mentioned the gene-based approach. The other initiative that again arises, and this is Adelena and Alex, is putting together a registry on cardiocutaneous disease. And you know, one of the problems is that nobody sees a lot of this. So you know, maybe you write a small case report, but it's all fragmented. Adelena has taken the lead on writing a paper, a review paper, which is accepted in Journal of the American College of Cardiology, that Alex is the first author and Adelena the last author, and there's about 50 other people, everyone who's contributed a little bit. But this is a stimulus to actually setting up an international registry for which the groundwork is actually being prepared. So NIKOS was the founder. He would be very proud of this as a father. And in terms of Yorgos, I think Yorgos and NIKOS were soulmates. They had a similar ambitions, some similar skills, and he's been a friend to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McKenna. And now another talent of yours revealed that you can put things in place, really. Thank you.
Επειδή έχουμε φάει χρόνο από το διάλειμμα και είμαστε υποχρεωμένοι να κάνουμε ένα μικρό διάλειμμα, το επόμενο τραπέζι θα αρχίσει στις 12 και 15. Next session is going to start 12.